And the line about you can join the army, well, yes, you can join with parental consent, the armed forces at 16 or 17, but you'll be kept out of the frontline active service because the UK is a signature of the UN Declaration of the Rights of Human Rights of the Child. That strikes me as a really good argument, actually, for raising the age at which you can enlist. It strikes me as a really poor argument for reducing the age at which you can vote. The UK has pretty much agreed on an age of adulthood, and that age of adulthood has been set at 18. So that clip you just played from Keir Starmer, I mean, contained many of the three Clarion campaign calls for the Votes at 16 brigade, all of which are less true now than they were 20, 30 years ago. You can leave education at 16, but actually you can't in England because you have to carry on and have educational qualifications up to 18. If you get a job, it has to be allied to further education. You can pay taxes, but actually, thanks to high tax thresholds and low youth wages, very few 16 to 18-year-olds pay the big money direct taxes in terms of national insurance or income tax. And the line about you can join the army, well, yes, you can join with parental consent, the armed forces at 16 or 17, but you'll be kept out of the frontline active service because the UK is a signature of the UN Declaration of the Rights of Human Rights of the Child. That strikes me as a really good argument, actually, for raising the age at which you can enlist. It strikes me as a really poor argument for reducing the age at which you can vote. So I think that those kind of arguments are actually less true now. And you think in terms of the way society has shifted, there are many ways in which you could talk about young people being marginalised. I'm not sure that lowering the voting age actually solves the problem that it's set up to solve.
Oh, well, let's hear from you now, Dr. Young Eichorn. What is the case for allowing 16-year-olds to vote?
I think the strongest case for it is seeing what has happened in places where the voting age has been lowered comprehensively. So when I first started studying this 12 years ago in Scotland, I wasn't sure whether I'd be in favor of it or against it. I wanted to see what empirically happens. And having looked at the data from Scotland, but also other countries where the voting age was lowered, at least at state elections or national elections even, what we typically see is 16 and 17-year-olds turn out in higher numbers than slightly older young adults when they get the vote at 18 or later. But also what we see now in multiple countries, Scotland, Austria, Germany, that actually that effect carries through into early adulthood. We see higher levels of turnout amongst people in their mid-20s if they were enfranchised at 16 than otherwise. So one of the things, there were a lot of fears, I think, and understandably plausible concerns about 16-year-olds voting before we could study what happened. And there were some real concerns that it would be a negative experience. But overall, the evidence internationally suggests that empirically nothing bad happens when 16-year-olds vote, but actually there's an opportunity to increase civic engagement of young people in a really positive way for them and for society more broadly, because they also have an impact on their parents, on national debates in quite a few of those instances when it's implemented well. So I think the strongest argument for votes at 16 comes from looking at what happens when it's implemented properly.
What do you say, though? We've had a text message in from Martin. He says 16-year-olds are idealistic and easily manipulated. Labour are trying to shore up their vote, although 16-year-olds might all vote Green. Let's set aside what 16-year-olds might or might not vote. What do you make of this idea that when you're 16, perhaps you're easier to manipulate your exposure to social media, perhaps? There's a lot more external... Maybe, and I don't want to do a disservice to 16-year-olds, maybe you're a little bit more impressionable at 16. Do you think that could be a problem?
Well, actually, what we see is young people, yes, are susceptible to social media content, but so are a lot of adults. Actually, there's little evidence to suggest that is specific to 16, 17-year-olds. What is interesting when we look at it is, in terms of studies, young people, 16, 17-year-olds is right, have a slightly lower level of knowledge about factual questions when we ask them about how does the electoral system work. And so it's a bit lower than in the rest of the population. But when the voting age is lowered, what's interesting is that 16, 17-year-olds are more likely to seek out information than otherwise they would have. So actually that gap gets narrowed when we see the voting age lowered. The second question is, and this is about this, it's basically about voter maturity, right? It's kind of that question is, do I just vote for something that looks cool? That's kind of the image that gets created, or do I vote for something that I think represents my interest? And there's been an incredibly detailed study done by a psychologist at the University of Erfurt in Germany, who basically looked at 16, 17-year-olds and the rest of the population making vote choices in relation to their policy preferences, going through an online tool that gets used by millions of Germans, in which you answer policy questions, and then at the end, you see kind of who you have the best match with. And they did this, and at the same time asked young people and adults, who would they vote for and how close is that match? And there was no significant difference between 16, 17-year-olds being able to identify the political party that represents their policy preferences and the rest of the population. So overall, those arguments about susceptibility, maybe making some erroneous choices and so on, it seems like they apply as much to 16, 17-year-olds as they apply to the rest of the population. So it's not a reason to say 16, 17-year-olds are not capable of voting. The evidence actually suggests, I said, if you give them the vote, more of them engage than otherwise would have.
Let me put another point to you that was made by my colleague Charlotte Ivers in today's Sunday Times in her debate on this very subject with Rod Liddle. She makes the point that actually if 16-year-olds were given the vote, that would force political parties to start engaging more with younger people, stop focusing their policies on pensioners, perhaps, or people of a certain age, and start thinking about younger people and people who could vote for certain policies that will actually affect them more, right, then perhaps it would affect people who are of a much older age, people who are getting their pensions. What do you think of that as a point of giving 16-year-olds the vote?
I mean, if I can come in there, I think that is a very serious argument, and I do think it is one that we need to engage with. But I don't think that voting at 16 solves that issue, because you're still going to have as one of your texters just said, you're still going to have the gap between the engaged and the disengaged, and that will just kind of perpetuate. I mean, it strikes me that a more novel and perhaps more radical way to address that point would be to look at other democracies that enforce compulsory voting. If you look in Australia, for instance, over the last 15 years, there was a move to force parties to take seriously environmental protection of the Gold Coast. And what that made is that all federal parties in Australia had to develop policies that were the concerns of surfers, because of compulsory voting in Australia. Surfers in Australia were the only one of their cohort who would actually kind of get out and vote. And if you look at, I think the point that elections are focused on, the election agenda tends to be focused on those people who we know are certain to vote. I think that's absolutely true. And the argument that putting 16-year-olds on the ballot would change that. I mean, it might make a marginal difference, and I think Jan's excellent research is well worth considering here. But there's still a gap between 16 and 18, and it seems to be that 16s might be preferable to 18s, not because they're independent, but because they are dependent, because they are still living at home. That seems to be the driver of that. So I think that it's a really serious argument. If we're serious about broadening the agenda that parties have to put to the public, then I think that we should think about how we're seriously going to do that. And I think a more radical solution than vote 16 might be the preferred solution.